On August 7, 1998, Al-Qaeda carried out its first major terrorist attack against American interests. The near simultaneous bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania that killed some 220 people. The embassy bombings provoked military reprisals in the form of a number of missile strikes on purported Al-Qaeda bases on Afghan soil, carried out on August 20th. We recognize these strikes will not eliminate the problem, said U.S. Secretary of Defense William Cohen shortly after the attacks. But our message is clear. There will be no sanctuary for terrorists and no limit to our resolve to defend American citizens and our interests against these cowardly attacks. The American Secretary of State Madeleine Albright did not hesitate with placing the blame for the attacks on bin Laden and the Taliban. She demanded that the Taliban surrender bin Laden so that they could interrogate him in the case. If they want us to recognize them, they are obligated to not give sanctuary to individuals who are regarded terrorists. In public, Mullah Omar strongly condemned the U.S. missile strikes on coast and repeated his previous statements that the Taliban would not surrender bin Laden to any third party. The Taliban leader was reportedly furious at what he saw as a violation of Afghanistan's sovereignty and indicated that there would be no more talks with the United States. On August 26th, he was quoted as saying, "What is there left to talk about now? Everything ended after the rocket attacks." At this point, Mullah Omar started openly criticizing U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. According to a U.S. government cable, Mullah Omar called the U.S. State Department in Washington on August 22nd, 1998, and spoke with Michael E. Maliniski, the U.S. Director for Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh Affairs. Reportedly, in a careful and controlled manner, he advised the U.S. government that the missile strikes in Afghanistan had been counterproductive to the United States, since they would increase hostility in the Islamic world against the United States. He suggested that President Bill Clinton must resign and that the United States should withdraw its forces from Saudi Arabia since the Islamic world sees the U.S. forces as a threat to Islam's holiest sites. He said that he had seen no evidence that bin Laden is guilty of the East Africa embassy bombings and that getting rid of one most individual would not end the problems posed by the United States by the Islamic world. There was little doubt that the missile strikes made Mullah Omar more distrustful of the United States. Basing on this, the literature has tended to draw the conclusion that the missile strikes brought the Taliban leader and bin Laden closer together. However, when discussing the Taliban regime's reactions to the missile strikes, it is crucial to differentiate between their reactions to the outside world and their internal reactions toward bin Laden. Based on available empirical evidence, there was no significant changes in the Taliban's internal policies toward Osama bin Laden. The Arabs in Al-Qaeda were not sure how Mullah Omar would react to the news of the East Africa embassy bombings. Only a few hours before the missile strikes, bin Laden was gathered with a group of Al-Qaeda members and other Arabs in Kabul. Mustafa Hamid, who was present at the meeting, recalled that they were talking about the East Africa bombings and how they would affect the situation in Afghanistan. They wondered why the American reaction was delayed and saw it as a sign of weakness. But it was not the American reaction that worried them most. It was that of the Taliban, they said. The Taliban had neither approved nor allowed the East African bombings to happen. Hamid was worried that there would be tension between bin Laden, who had hurt the Taliban's interests, and the Taliban. Abu Musab al-Suri, who had seen the tension building up over months, said after the missile strikes that he expected a harsh response from Mullah Omar and that the Taliban would close down bin Laden's camps. But the reaction was not as strong as al-Suri expected. The Taliban did not accuse bin Laden of being behind the embassy strikes. An internal al-Qaeda document found in 2011 suggests that at the time of the 1998 embassy bombings, the Taliban's opposition to bin Laden wasn't apparent or even clear. The Taliban's lack of interest in the U.S. embassy bombings is reflected in the Taliban's internal reactions toward bin Laden. These reactions were not spurred by the East Africa bombings, but by bin Laden's media activities afterward. Bin Laden gave at least two media statements after the embassy strikes. On August 18th, Bin Laden's organization, the Global Islamic Front, issued a communique in which they praised the act and warned of new attacks against America. 2 days later, Bin Laden probably felt compelled to ease the pressure on the Taliban leadership. On August 20th, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri delivered a statement by phone to the Pakistani journalist Rahimullah Yousafzai, which was claimed to be from Bin Laden. Bin Laden's statement explicitly denied any involvement in the Nairobi and Dar es Salaam bombings, although it called on Muslims to continue fighting Jews and Americans. On August 22nd to August 23rd, the Taliban's Inner Shura, the top leadership, held a meeting during which several members, including the governor of Kandahar, Mullah Hassan, putting pressure on Mullah Omar to take measures against Bin Laden. We do not know the details of these discussions, but other sources give a good indication of Mullah Omar's stance on this issue and his immediate reactions toward Bin Laden. Sources confirmed that Mullah Omar was not so much troubled by the terrorist attacks in East Africa as by the fact that Bin Laden was issuing statements without his permission. Pakistani newspaper, The News, quoted Mullah Omar as saying after the strikes, "It is impossible to have two distinct and parallel emirats in Afghanistan. We have a central authority that is led by the Taliban and it should be obeyed." The article was written by Rahimullah Yousafzai, who allegedly spoke with Mullah Omar by phone on August 23rd. Same article said that Mullah Omar had sent the delegation of Bin Laden, asking him to show restraint and leave it to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan to take the required measures to defend itself and give an appropriate answer to the U.S. attack on its soil. Initially, Mullah Omar reacted to Bin Laden the same way as he had done in the past, by sending him a letter asking him to stop issuing threatening statements. On August 25th, a Pakistani news agency, Wiklat al-Unha, used by the Taliban, quoted Mullah Omar as saying from his headquarters in Kandahar, quote, "I sent a letter to Bin Laden yesterday in which I clearly asked him to not issue military and political statements against anyone from our soil. Osama's hostile remarks against the Americans given from our soil angered me, and I stressed to him that he shall not do that. Bin Laden broke his pledge to not use our soil to issue such statements, after I previously had forbidden him to do that." End quote. The account of Mullah Omar's letter is substantiated by al-Qaeda's internal documents. In September of 2000, an al-Qaeda member was jotting down the main points of a speech Bin Laden was giving to a group of members. The topic of the speech was the history of the jihadist movement. The Mujahideen struck at a time when many of its leaders had surrendered from armed struggle, the notebook reads. In the context, the statement probably refers to the de-radicalization process taking place in Egypt from 1997 onward, during which a large number of Egyptian militants, in particular members of the Gamma Islamiyah, refrained from violent activity. The strike most likely refers to the East Africa embassy bombings on August 7, 1998, which were the only major al-Qaeda operations carried out at the time. According to the same notebook, the next points of Bin Laden's speech dealt with the letters received by the Sheikh, asking him to stop his speeches and incitement, and the Sheikh's mistake in sending the bayam, which probably refers to the statement of the Global Islamic Front in the aftermath of the embassy bombings, or Bin Laden's statement on August 20th, given by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri by phone. It seems clear that it was one of these statements that had angered Mullah Omar, not the East Africa bombings themselves. This is further substantiated by Mullah Mutawaki, who noted in a meeting with U.S. representatives in Islamabad in November of 1998, quote, "While the United States believed that Bin Laden was the head of a terrorist network, the Taliban can only charge him with two particulars. The first was an unauthorized news conference in Khost, and the statement he had made following the airstrikes. These violated the Taliban-imposed prohibition on him speaking out, end quote. It supports the hypothesis that Mullah Omar, like many others in Afghanistan and Pakistan at the time, did not know or did not want to know anything about bin Laden's role in international terrorism. At the same time, the Taliban reacted promptly every time bin Laden was seen to violate Mullah Omar's direct orders not to talk to the press. The U.S. missile strikes led to increased international pressure on the Taliban, especially from its major ally in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. September 19, 1998, a Saudi delegation led by the intelligence chief, Prince Turki Al Faisal, flew into Kandahar to meet with Mullah Omar. Al Faisal had been on a secret visit to Afghanistan that previous June and asked the Taliban to expel bin Laden to Saudi Arabia. According to Prince Faisal, at the June 1988 meeting, Mullah Omar had agreed in principle to hand over bin Laden to Saudi Arabia, and they had agreed to jointly convene a committee to discuss the details of the bin Laden handover. In September of 1998, Al Faisal returned to Kandahar and demanded that Osama bin Laden be handed over to him. But this time, Mullah Omar refused to comply. To the surprise of the foreign delegation, he said that he had never promised to hand over bin Laden to Saudi Arabia and that there could have been a mistake by the interpreters during the previous meeting. According to Iqtafar Murshid, Pakistan's special envoy to Pakistan, who himself was present at the meeting, the event developed into a bickering between Mullah Omar and Prince Turki bin Faisal. Prince Faisal reportedly became furious and suggested that Mullah Omar should learn Arabic in order to avoid such misunderstandings in the future. In return, Mullah Omar blamed Prince Faisal for allying himself with the Americans. God has given you everything, but yet you cannot defend yourselves against puny Iraq, and therefore you invited the Americans into your country to protect you and to fight your battles. Needless to say, Saudi Prince bin Faisal returned to Saudi Arabia insulted and empty-handed. A few days after the meeting, Saudi Arabia announced that they would break diplomatic ties with the Taliban regime. Mullah Omar had by now used bin Laden-like rhetoric several times to defend his political decisions, giving rise to speculations that Mullah Omar was influenced by bin Laden's ideology. However, there are few sources that can substantiate this claim. Mullah Omar's rhetoric about Saudi Arabia was not particular for bin Laden. Rather, it reflected the widespread sentiments of the Saudi Sauha that originated in 1991, when the Saudi regime allowed the United States to establish military bases on its soil. There are other sources indicating that bin Laden was hardly in a position to influence Mullah Omar ideologically. A few days after the debacle between Mullah Omar and Prince Faisal, on September 21st to September 23rd, 1998, the Taliban convened a Grand Shura in Kabul. The Grand Shura was different from the Indus Shura that had met in Kandahar the month before. During the Grand Shura, a council of around 1,500 ulema from across Afghanistan was convened in Kabul to discuss a number of topics and give policy advice to Mullah Omar. Officially, they were there to discuss 5 topics. 4 of them were related to the Taliban's regime's ongoing conflict with Iran, and the 5th was concerned with the legitimacy of the Taliban government. However, there were rumors that the Ulema Council would discuss other topics as well, including the bin Laden issue. A U.S. Embassy cable quoted a well-informed contact saying that Mullah Omar had authorized the council to make a final decision on the presence of Osama bin Laden on Afghan territory. The same information appeared in Al Hayat on September 23rd. The newspaper sources held it as likely that the council would allow bin Laden to stay in Afghanistan on the condition that he respects the laws of the Islamic Emirate and avoid giving political statements on carrying out operations from Afghan territory. The Ulema conference was convened only 2 days after Mullah Omar's debacle with Prince Turki Al Faisal, which had stirred controversy within the Taliban. This may have contributed to bringing the bin Laden issue to the discussion table during the conference. Taliban's prime minister in Kabul, Mullah Rabbani, was reportedly frustrated with Mullah Omar for causing a diplomatic crisis between the Taliban regime and Saudi Arabia. It is likely that the event had led to a renewed debate concerning bin Laden's status in Afghanistan. Sources from inside the Arab community in Afghanistan had confirmed that Mullah Omar convened an Ulema Council to discuss the fate of bin Laden. Captured documents give further indications that bin Laden issue was brought up by the Taliban for public discussion after the U.S. missile strikes. A booklet printed by the Taliban's Ministry of Education in late 1988 contained a number of essays written by Afghan, Pakistani, and Arab intellectuals discussing the status of Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. They argued from religious, legal, and political points of view that bin Laden had the right to receive protection by the Taliban in Afghanistan. The lineup of authors include theologians such as the Pakistani Mufti Abdul Rahim, the deputy leader of Al Rashid Trust, but also various Afghan professors in economy, law, and political science. Documents indicate that the Taliban's decision to protect bin Laden after the U.S. missile strikes found acceptance far outside Mullah Omar's inner shura. In other words, it was not a decision by a small fundamentalist faction within the Taliban. This perspective has rarely been presented in existing literature on Afghanistan. Part of the reason for this is probably that a few Afghans after 9/11 would be willing to admit they supported the Taliban's decision to host bin Laden in the 1990s. We do know if Mullah Omar actually authorized the Shura in 1998 to make a final decision on bin Laden's status. But we know that after the day after the Shura's last session, on September 24th, Mullah Omar sent a fax to the U.S. government saying that the Taliban regime will not and cannot change its policies as they are based on Islam. The tone of the letter is uncompromising. Quote, "Our policy is clear. It's Islamic policy. We cannot change it. It is not up to us to change it. We have no power or authority to change it. Almighty God has obligated us to follow this policy. If you have objections to our policy or our deeds, or if you call it un-Islamic, that is not right. All Muslims of the world agree that this is Islamic. But if you still believe that it is not Islamic, then we cannot try to convince you," end quote. Although it seems to leave room for some dialogue, then we could try to convince you. The tone of the letter differs noticeably from Mullah Omar's phone conversations with the U.S. State Department a month earlier. In the phone conversation on August 22nd, he had defended his decision to protect bin Laden, saying that he had seen no evidence of bin Laden's guilt. In the September 24th letter, he did not explicitly defend bin Laden, but only referred to the fact that the Muslim people think that bin Laden is not guilty. Muslims believe that the Osama bin Laden issue is just an excuse made by the United States, and that this is harming the United States. In the last statement, the question of evidence and guilt was not mentioned at all. Instead, Mullah Omar emphasized that the Taliban's policies are unchangeable, since they are based solely on Islamic law and the will of Muslims. It appears as if the question of bin Laden's guilt had been rendered irrelevant. One possible interpretation of these events is that the Ulema Council in Kabul did indeed rule that bin Laden cannot be expelled to the United States, and that Mullah Omar is conveying this view to the U.S. administration in his September 24th letter. This would at least explain the uncompromising tone of the letter. Meanwhile, there was an internal battle within the Taliban concerning how to cope with bin Laden. The question was probably not so much whether to expel him to the United States, as this would be a highly radical step to take at the time, although several Taliban officials expressed that they wished bin Laden out of their country. As discussed earlier, the Taliban was in a difficult position because a number of religious scholars in the region had already sanctioned bin Laden's political agenda. As a compromise, several Taliban officials started pushing Mullah Omar to take measures against bin Laden in order to restrict his activities while residing on Taliban-controlled territory. Maulali Wakil Ahmad Mustawakil also called for increased restrictions on bin Laden's activities and hoped that this would eventually cause bin Laden to leave of his own free will and thus save the Taliban from the awkward position it found itself in. In a meeting with U.S. officials on November 28, 1998, Mutawakkali said, quote, "There appears to be two ways to deal with the problem. One would be to expel bin Laden by force, which would cause internal problems for the Taliban. The other would be to restrict his activities in such a way that he would decide to leave on his own volition, as this was being done. This was what the Taliban hoped would result from their current policy," end quote. During the autumn of 1998, bin Laden made efforts at appeasing the Taliban leadership. At the end of August 1998, Mullah Omar received a written promise from bin Laden that he will not carry out attacks against any other country. Also, bin Laden started praising the Taliban leader publicly and privately. In November 1998, he wrote letters to several Deobandi scholars in Pakistan, asking them to support the Taliban regime and incite the Pakistani people to fight for the Taliban, although he also promoted his anti-American agenda in these letters. At the end of 1998, Mullah Omar was still reluctant to impose harsher restrictions on bin Laden's media activities. But after a series of fatal interviews in December that year, even Mullah Omar agreed that there could be no more interviews with bin Laden.